Is this the microphone I need to speak into? Okay. Friday morning, a lot of hungover people. All right, it's 9:01. Welcome to the Decentralization talk. The official title, I believe, is Radical Decentralization as Road to Anarcho-Capitalism. If you're not into anarcho-capitalism, you're in luck. This doesn't require you to be so. And if you like anarcho-capitalism, you're also in luck, because then we'll talk about this as a strategy to achieving that. However, this is the sort of thing where it's good either way. If we adopt radical decentralist principles, it will simply move us more in the direction of limiting the state and expanding people's self-determination and basic human rights and so on. And I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm the editor for Mises.org, for Mises Wire. So if you ever want to write an article for us, just send it to me directly, and I'll email you back about that. But my background, my graduate work was mostly in political science, and so this is really more of a field for that. It has to do with, it's more of an issue of international relations. It's more the domain of historians and so on. We're looking about at the construction of states and their interactions between states and really what that means for the people who live in them. And there is certainly an economic aspect to it. in what we'll see and what we'll find is that smaller states are more economically prosperous, and that small states are what paved the way for Europe's prosperity. And then finally, we'll look at a couple of the objections to a world based on small states and small communities. But let's start with just really defining our terms. What do we mean by decentralization? And in the political science literature, of course, we have different types of states. We have unitary states, we have federalist states. That is, you can have governments where absolutely everything really functions at the pleasure of the central government. And probably the most typical example of this would maybe be France, where the government in Paris really sets the boundaries of local districts and overwhelmingly is responsible for the legislation that governs the country. And there's not much sovereignty afforded to local government units throughout the country. At the other extreme, you might find a country like Switzerland, where you have a variety of cantons, kind of equivalent to the US state, which have a high degree of independence and sovereignty. And the confederation, the central government, is very limited in what it can do and has to afford a certain amount of independence then to these different districts. Now, so we can look at that, and we can see that some states then write into their structure a decentralized structure. You might have a constitution that says that we have some sort of, there are guidelines here that provide some powers to certain levels of government and some powers to the main central government. In some cases, though, decentralization is just de facto because your central government is too weak, really, to impose uniformity on the country. And historically, that's often been the case, and it's still the case in many countries today where there's a weaker central government and that simply lacks the resources to go and ensure compliance from the regions and to bring them to heel. And, but all countries have some degree of this. And also we know that internationally there's decentralization as well. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But being pro-decentralist, recognizing the value of decentralization as a means of limiting state power has long been baked in, built into the liberal ideology. And when I say liberal, I mean 19th century, 18th century liberal, what Americans call classical liberal now. Most foreigners would know what you mean by liberal. It means basically libertarian. Only Americans decided that liberal now means social democrat, which is really the proper term. If you want to describe a leftist who's in favor of the welfare state and so on, this is just a social democrat. In a classroom context or an academic context, liberal just simply means people like Thomas Jefferson, people like Frederick Bastiat, and so on. And so we find, though, that the issue of decentralization is a core concept for the liberals. And looking for a definition, we might go then to the Frenchman, Charles Montalembert, who was a 19th century liberal in the same school as Alexis de Tocqueville. Also, maybe even later, Gustave de Molinari and Frederick Bastiat as well. And he defines decentralization as the sum of quote-unquote liberties, local and personal, municipal and provincial. And he was in favor of promoting these in all possible ways. And so what he's saying is that you've got other entities outside the state. You've got persons, of course, but you've also got local municipal groups, you've got religious groups, and so on. And if we promote the liberties of these groups, we're limiting the state through that way. And by maintaining the integrity even of these different groups and having them as counterbalances to the central state, this can be very important as well. And another Frenchman, Benjamin Constant, who with only some exaggeration, some people have called the inventor of liberalism, he says, the interests and memories which are born of local customs contain a germ of resistance, which authority suffers only with regret, and which it hastens to eradicate. With individuals, it has its way more easily. It rolls its enormous weight over them effortlessly as over sand. So we definitely want not just then independence and liberty for the individuals within a society, but it's also important that they be able to create these other organizations that the state hates, by the way. right? So any sort of local association, local group that has different ways of going about the world, different ways of thinking than the central government. The central state hates that and wants to destroy it. But it has an easier time of doing that if those organizations are reduced or eradicated, and instead we embrace this idea of just individuals who have liberty and take away the independence of certain groups within the state. And that's generally what we see when we're talking about a state or a confederation or so on that's been reduced to a variety of sovereignties, whether it's a state or a canton or a province or some other sort of group. The idea is that that group would serve as some sort of counterbalance to the power of the central state. And this is just simply typical for a lot of debate amongst liberals in the 18th and 19th century. Now, this comes down to a historical view as well. There's this, of course, long time prevailing myth that in the Middle Ages, all of Europe was ruled by despots and theocrats who enjoyed almost total untrammeled power, and they claimed total divine acceptance of everything that they thought should happen, and that it was only with the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and so on that people started to see that that government power could be problematic and we should limit it in some way. This certainly is not the way it actually happened, and Alexis de Tocqueville talks about this a little bit. Here's a passage from Democracy in America, the second volume. During the aristocratic ages which preceded the present time, the sovereigns of Europe had been deprived of or had relinquished many of the rights inherent in their power. Not 100 years ago, so he's saying 1740s, amongst the greater part of European nations, numerous private persons and corporations were sufficiently independent to administer justice, to raise and maintain troops, to levy taxes, and frequently even to make or interpret the law. But what he's saying is that at some point in the 19th century then, certainly after the French Revolution, this began to be reversed and you started to get a larger bureaucratic state, more state centralization. And so he was lamenting that that was the case and saw these earlier aristocratic groups and religious groups and so on as providing an obstacle to the centralization of state power. And he says that the state has everywhere resumed to itself alone these natural attributes to sovereign power. In all matters of government, the state tolerates no intermediate agent between itself and the people, and in general business, it directs the people by its own immediate influence. So he's, in Democracy in America Part 2, he looks extensively at the issue of decentralization and how this is what really stands in the way then of total despotism. Most people recognize on a basic fundamental level that decentralization has value. We could consider, for example, a global system that was all one giant state. Most people, if you ask them, would think that was probably undesirable. And it doesn't even have to be a global state. We could just look at something like, say, South America. Why isn't South America all just one giant state? And why shouldn't it be? A lot of people would identify that there are perhaps different regional interests and historical reasons why all of these people shouldn't just simply be within one group. And if we look at the mechanics of it, we could immediately see a big problem. We see that among the population of South America, Brazilians constitute very nearly 50% of all the population, like 49.8% or something like that. And so you can see immediately what's going to happen, right? Whatever it is that interests Brazil and behooves Brazil, all they have to do is ally with one other country and they can therefore dictate policy to everyone else in our South American republic then. And so a lot of people recognized from the beginning that if they were to have any sort of self-determination, they were going to have to decentralize then the state. And this was, of course, the original goal of many independence fighters in South America was that, well, we're going to break off from Spain and have one large free state. But it didn't work out that way because there are regional differences, and people recognize that in matters of language, in matters of economy and industry and so on. It doesn't make sense to simply shove everybody into the same country. At the global level, of course, this would make very little sense. You would have a country with 1 billion people like China, or a country with 1 billion people like India. If these were governed on a one-man, one-vote sort of principle, they'd be outvoting everybody all the time. All of the Americas doesn't have as many people as some single countries in Asia. So that's certainly problematic. And people don't think of themselves as being pro-decentralization just because they think there should be many countries in the world, but that's essentially what they are. They're conceding that concept. Now, we're here today to talk about radical decentralization, though. We can find lots of decentralization in various times and places, and we can see that the liberals promoted it and so on. But what is it when it's radical? Now, the phrase radical decentralization, as far as I know, it was mostly used and popularized by Rothbard in just a few places. And it's something a little bit different. I think we could say that if we were to define radical decentralization, it's a type of decentralization that is robust both in terms of the amount of sovereignty attained by each individual unit and the degree of its localism, that is essentially the smallness of it or the population within it. Not necessarily geographically small, but small in terms of population. And you would probably need both of those concepts. Then obviously we can have states that have a high degree of sovereignty, which the United States, for example, which has sovereignty in spades, right? No other nation state really threatens US sovereignty in any way. And at the same time, though, this isn't a highly local sort of government. Even if you take into account some of the federalism involved as well, this is a huge state governed for the most part by 5 Supreme Court justices who then dictate to 330 million people what's constitutional and what's acceptable and what's not. That's certainly not radical decentralization. At the same time, we could have a very high degree of locality. We could have a country that has lots of different municipal governments and lots of small units within it. But if they are essentially at the mercy of a central government in whether in a constitutional way or a de facto way, then we wouldn't say that's radical decentralization as well. What we've got to have is a lot of real, largely independent states, not necessarily totally independent. They could be in some kind of loose confederation or some sort of association of that sort. But if we're going to say that they're mostly can do what they want, especially internally, and there's a large number of them, then we would say that's a radically decentralized system. Now, the international system today is arguably radically decentralized. It depends on what you mean by a lot of states. It could certainly be much more radical. Now, the political scientists have a word for the international system, and that is it's an anarchic system. And so some people I'm familiar with this act as if anarchy just means chaos, but within the context of academic political science, it doesn't mean that at all. It means, in fact, in many cases, a large system that has its own legal system and very set and commonly followed ways of acting among the independent entities. And this is what the international system is right now. And we've got about 200 odd countries that are all at least technically sovereign, but many of them are, in fact, sovereign in the fact that they can do what they want without a whole lot of interference from another state. Now, yes, the US and other major powers try to interfere in a lot of cases, but we do have mitigating factors there, such as international law and the fact that, especially in the modern world, invading and bombing other countries back into the Stone Age has significant cost to it, especially if those people are your trading partners and if it makes you a pariah state among other states. So there are limits on what just powerful states can do in the international system. And we would definitely say that this is an anarchic system and one that is certainly decentralized. Radically so? Arguably, it's less radical now than in the past. And if we look then at what it was that made Europe rich, we come upon the theory of the European miracle. And this is a theory among historians who wanted to go in and they wanted to see why is it that Europe, which had been this economic backwater in the early Middle Ages and had seemed very primitive and unimpressive compared to, say, the great empires of the East, especially China, how is it that just 500 years later, Europe was this major, massive economic power that could easily dominate entire continents elsewhere and so on? And one reason given for this is that it was due to Europe's radical decentralization that existed throughout much of the Middle Ages. And we go back to that myth with this idea that Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church and it was all this one huge theocratic state and so on, and that of course wasn't the reality at all. What you really had was a system of hundreds of small principalities where certainly the church tried to exert its influence over these states, but usually failed considerably because, of course, the locals in these places had their own interests, the princes had their own interests and resisted. So you had a constant back and forth, you had a tension between the religious authorities and the secular authorities and the civil authorities and other groups as well. And this led to a situation where you never had any single state that dominated the region. This was very much unlike China and unlike the Islamic world, where you had much stronger states who were able to exert a lot of influence over a smaller number of states. And so historian Ralph Raico, who he's got books in the bookstore here, I highly recommend them, and was long an associate of Rothbard, certainly one of the best liberal historians, he examines the issue of the European miracle. And he sums it up this way. He says, although geographical factors played a role, the key to Western development is to be found in the fact that while Europe constituted a single civilization, Latin Christendom, it was at the same time radically decentralized. In contrast to other cultures, especially China, India, and the Islamic world, Europe comprised a system of divided and hence competing powers and jurisdictions. And have you ever seen a map of the Holy Roman Empire? It was by no means really any sort of unified district, in no way a nation state as we think of it today. It was just a countless number of tiny provinces and principalities and so on, where you could easily travel from one to the other. And what did this mean in terms of daily practice? Well, an example that Raico would give would be something like this. I am a merchant, and I live in I run my operations out of a small principality that's on the Rhine River in Northwest Europe. And the prince in my region where I am, he decides he's going to raise taxes considerably. And so what am I to do? Well, a lot of modern people under democratic theory and so on would say, oh, well, you need to get together an interest group, and maybe you can go to the legislature and ask for a different law and all of that sort of thing. But that's not the way it worked at all. The easiest thing to do in many cases was simply to move your operations slightly down the river. And since these principalities were so small, this was quite feasible. You didn't have to leave Europe. You didn't have to pull up everything and move hundreds or thousands of miles away. You could simply move to a neighboring district in many cases, where you might have a prince who was very glad to have you as a merchant, who could then bring wealth into his district. And this would be contrasted with China. Whereas in China, if you had a problem with some law passed down by an imperial bureaucrat or the emperor or so on, where could you go? You could leave China, but what did that require? That required you possibly to move hundreds, if not 1,000 miles away. Also, you were gonna have to go someplace where you're gonna have to learn a completely different language. You're gonna have to go to some place where civilization was totally different. And if you think that moving, of course, from one country to another is a big cultural change today, you can only imagine what it was in the year 1300 and so on. It was enormous. And in Europe, however, that wasn't the case. If I moved down the river, they quite possibly speak the same language. And even if they didn't speak quite the same language, still the educated classes spoke Latin. And so I could at least then conduct business to some extent and then learn the local language, which was probably related in a similar language anyway. And then, of course, they had the same religion, too, most likely. And so I didn't have to change my religion, which, of course, you would have to do if you switched empires or something like that in other parts of the world. So you can see then how the cost to escaping one jurisdiction is much, much lower in Europe than it is in another place, where you got to change religion, language, everything, leave your family behind, maybe even leave your property behind because this empire was strong enough to prevent you from taking your property with you. And this, all of these events then conspired to create a system where European princes were afraid, really, in many cases, to really impose themselves and extract taxes in a draconian way, because they thought people would simply go away then. And from a historian, Jean Bachelar, he says, the first condition for the maximization of economic efficiency is the liberation of civil society with respect to the state. The expansion of capitalism owes its origins and raison d'etre to political anarchy. So Bachelar is talking on the European miracle here as well. He's saying that if you want to maximize economic efficiency and growth, you need to limit civil society. And how do you do that? Political anarchy. That's really the key. Now, and then, so to really just drive home the issue, we have another Rako quote here where he says, decentralization of power also came to mark the domestic arrangements of the various European polities. Here, feudalism, which produced a nobility rooted in feudal right rather than in state service, is thought by a number of scholars to have played an important role. Through the struggle for power within the realms, representative bodies came into being, and princes often found their hands tied by the charters of rights, like Magna Carta, for instance, which they were forced to grant their subjects. In the end, even within the relatively small states of Europe, power was dispersed among estates, orders, chartered towns, religious communities, corps, universities, so on, each with its own guaranteed liberties. So this wasn't like planned ahead of time. This wasn't, hey, let's create a little kingdom here and we're gonna write everything out and who's got what rights and so on. This was a process that took place over centuries where you might have a group of bourgeois merchants in a city who gained enough political and economic power that they could start to demand their rights. So then they got something written in for them into the charter that gave them their own city and town where they could live by their own laws and so on. And this compounded over time where he ended up with a complex system of different rights and different privileges and so on that ended up really sapping the power of the central state. Now we see these advantages continue today. There's significant research out there showing that small states today, that they do better, that their GDP per capita is higher, that these states are more flexible, more versatile. Even the World Bank admits this. In some studies, well, in one study, we can see that the World Bank concludes, quote, controlling for locations, smaller states are actually richer than other states in per capita GDP, unquote. It is true that because of their small size, these countries can be more susceptible to volatility when there's an economic collapse and so on. But, quote, their openness pays off in growth. And we've seen other studies where this applies even in Africa, where smaller African states are more open, they have more free trade, and they're more able to deal with economic crises and problems. This isn't due just to the economic issue as well, but you can see how in a smaller state you would have left less in conflict among different ethnic groups and so on. So they, of course, opponents of decentralization claim, oh, well, any country that gets its independence and so on will immediately close its borders and raise tariffs and so on. There's no evidence to support this claim at all. What they always do is point to like some one weird exception like North Korea or something like this. But when we look out there and examine the world as a whole, clearly the preponderance of evidence points to the fact that small countries are more likely to be open with smaller taxes. And in fact, other research has shown that small countries benefit everybody, even the people in the large countries, because what you get then are small countries that are neighboring to large countries. The small countries want to attract capital, because large countries are able to attract capital because they're large, they have, in the era of fiat currency, they have larger economies trading in that currency, there's economies of scale that take place in larger countries and so on. But if you have a neighboring small country, they're gonna try and then suck away some of those resources by lowering taxes or lowering their regulations. And this is why you see EU officials and people like Angela Merkel complaining about how we need tax harmonization. They want to pass legislation that requires all countries to have more or less similar tax rates. Because if we keep letting the Irish or the Slovenians and so on setting their own tax rates, it's going to set them low because they're going to want to try to compete with the larger states, and we can't have that. So we need to set similar tax rates everywhere. And this is because they recognize smaller states they're kind of a thorn in the side of the larger states because they're always searching for ways to actually appeal to the merchant class. And there's lots of other ways that we can look at the ways that small countries are better. Lots of measures. And there was a recent book that came out by a person named Frank Buckley called American Secession. And there's a section of the book he does a lot of regressions and so on, trying to find out what are the benefits of small states. And you take those regressions with a grain of salt, but I think they can be illustrative of things. And he concludes after running a bunch of these that quote, smaller countries are happier and less corrupt. They're less inclined to throw their weight around militarily, and they're freer. If there are advantages to bigness, the costs exceed the benefits. Bigness is badness. And you'll notice a lot of the time when we see all these lists of the world's happiest countries and the world's freest, cleanest countries, safest countries, and so on, it's usually a country like Norway. And of course, what they immediately say, oh, it's because Norway is a socialist country, which isn't even true. But they don't consider that Norway has 5 million people. And that this is the same size as, say, Colorado or Minnesota, if those were independent countries. These are small countries. Sweden has around 10 million, Denmark has under 10 million. These are small states even in the US context. And so maybe the smallness has something to do with it. Buckley would claim that yes. I mean, obviously we know it's not because they're allegedly more socialist. Now, so how would radical decentralization actually work in real life? So we can accept that smallness is good, that we need more small states. How is that actually achieved? Well, fortunately, Ludwig von Mises provides us with a blueprint for this. He was very concerned with self-determination. How do we avoid conflict between different ethnic groups? Mises was especially concerned with different language groups, partly because he was consumed with the issue of the world after World War I, where they were redrawing the lines on the map well, Polish-speaking people go here and German-speaking people go there and so on. Mises was very familiar with the sort of conflict that arises out of those sorts of conflicts. And he basically said, here's how you do it. This is how you get smaller countries, and you do it in a just and reasonable way. The right of self-determination in regard to the question of membership in a state thus means whenever the inhabitants of a particular territory, whether it be a single village, a whole district, or a series of adjacent districts, make it known by a freely conducted plebiscite that they no longer wish to remain united to the state in which they belong at the time, but wish either to form an independent state or to attach themselves to some other state, their wishes are to be respected and complied with. This is the only feasible and effective way of preventing revolutions and civil and international wars, unquote. So he's recognized that there are lots of different places in the world where you have people of different ethnic, language, whatever, economic interests and so on, and they're all shoved into a single state together. That's gonna lead to civil war, it's gonna lead to unrest, it's gonna lead to problems. What's the solution to this? You let the people in that region take a vote. And then if they wanna leave, you let them leave. You certainly don't fight a war over it. And he goes on, though, this isn't just for big areas. If it were, quote, if it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination, that is this right of secession, to every individual person, it would have to be done. This is impracticable only because of compelling technical considerations which make it necessary that the right of self-determination is restricted to the will of the majority of the inhabitants of areas large enough to count as territorial units in the administration of the country. So Mises is coming out right here and saying, basically that theoretically anarchy, where you had just a small single family, theoretically could then vote to leave your nation state. Or failing that, maybe a small village, maybe a neighborhood. And he sees that there's really only a practical problem to this, that because of economies of scale and some other issues, you need a group of people large enough to actually administer some sort of district or some sort of province. How big that is? Well, he probably imagined that was actually really quite small, looking at the context in which he's writing. We're certainly not talking about something that required 10 or 20 million people. You could be looking at 50,000 people, which in his book, Human Scale, Kirkpatrick Sale says that this is the correct size for any state is 50,000. That the entire world should be city-states composed of 50,000 people, and anything larger than that is absurd, and it could no way reflect the will of the people who live there. And so what does that mean? That just means you have a system of where people are getting together all the time, determining, do we want to be part of this nation state? And if we want to secede from it, we will. And we'll hold one of these freely elected plebiscites, and the right of self-determination dictates that you let us do this. And what this means then for the issue of really limiting state power is that we need to recognize what happens then when a large state breaks up into smaller pieces. And what this means is that we almost certainly want more states. The more states there are, the more choices you have. So what Mises was trying to accomplish with his strategy of having different groups break off from larger states or join other states is that people are actually able to engage in some sort of choice. And this then reduces the amount of monopoly that each state is able to exercise over people. And there are some objections raised against this. The problem is, what if you have some people in that district who voted no? They didn't want to leave. The answer to that, of course, is then more secession, to break that leaving district into smaller districts. So say California votes to secede from the United States. Clearly, you're going to have some people within that region that voted no because they wanted to stay in the U.S. Some people will argue, well, you can never have secession because of that, because there's always going to be some minority vote. The answer doesn't lie then in forever prohibiting secession and just ending decentralization. The answer lies then in allowing then California to break up into smaller pieces, and then the people in those areas can do what they want. Now, of course, there's mixing of population in certain cases, but there's really only so much you can do with that. I mean, what do you say? Just that whoever's in the minority then is just stuck, or whoever's in the majority then just gets to dictate everywhere always? Whoever's in these places, at some point you have to recognize that just the status quo borders everywhere are not ordained by God, and that it could be that these do not suit the arrangements, and that some people might even have to move in order to take advantage of the freedom offered by other neighboring jurisdictions. Now, this is then enhanced by the option of having more states. So let's think about it. We've got the United States, and it's all one big state. If we divide it up into two, now I have more choices. So if I live just west of the Mississippi, so I live in Kansas, and I decide that Western America, this new republic, is very oppressive to me, I'm going to move to Eastern America now. So I can do that. I just have to move across the Mississippi River. Let's say that's now the border. Now, what do I have to do to make that move? I don't have to move very far. I might still be able to move close enough where I could even visit my family on a regular basis. I don't have to learn a new religion. The climate isn't significantly different. If there's some level of freedom in trade, I can even continue to trade with a lot of my old customers. There's a lot of advantages to that. It's exactly what we saw in this earlier example from Europe, in that I don't have to leave the civilization, I don't have to change my religion or anything like that. I simply now need to move slightly across this new border that's been created. Now then, what if we take those two states and we break them up into four? Now, whatever state I'm in, I have three other choices that are relatively nearby, where the same language and same culture is basically practiced. And you can see where it goes from there. The worst possible situation, of course, is one single global state, where I have no other choices at all. And this is the perfect state, since the state is founded on the idea of creating a total monopoly over the means of coercion. If there's only one single state, I've finally attained that monopoly. In a world where there's a multitude of states, that monopoly is never really quite achieved. And so there's no really true states in the world in the true pure form, because you can move to a certain extent. However, states raise the cost of doing that, so it's difficult to do. So as long as the United States remains one single state and I want to leave, I've only got two other choices really in North America. I can move to Mexico or Canada. If I go to Mexico, I have to learn a new language. If I move to Canada, I still might probably have to move 300, 400, even 1,000 miles away and so on. And that's a pretty high cost that imposes on me. And that's, of course, if Canada will even have me, which they may not. And, but what we do know from our earlier empirical evidence is that a large number of smaller states is actually more open to movement within those states, because they're always trying to attract more capital, especially people from the merchant class. So the key here is we want to bring about more choice. We want people to be able to look out there and see, oh, well, there's 5 other choices just within 500 miles that I can move to. And so if we look at decentralization in the context of how do we move toward a more anarcho-capitalist society, toward a more true free society, the answer lies then in creating a lot of states. 200 globally is far too few. Now, a lot of people say, well, then we need to reduce and secede down to the individual level. There should be 7 billion states. Okay, that's a fine ideal. But it would be a massive improvement just if we had 1,000 states instead of 200, or 10,000, or 20,000, or 30,000. That's still a lot of people per state if you divide 30,000 into 7 billion, right? These aren't like tiny, tiny jurisdictions. However, the amount of choice you would have would be significant. And then, of course, once you start to get down to a certain micro level, at some point, the state really ceases to become a state and is more like a homeowners association, or something where you're simply living within a district where you have considerable influence and say, and if it's just no big deal to leave and go to a neighboring district, is this even really a state in the way that we think of it? Because its power has been so curtailed at that point. Now, a lot of people will continue to complain. Well, yes, even if I had 100 choices nearby though, there's still going to be people there that I don't like, and it's not going to be a perfect situation for me, and so really I should be able to just have my own state where I do whatever I want. Well, now we're just well into complete fantasy land, right? This isn't the way the market works, of course. If you want to go out and buy a car, unless you're fabulously wealthy and can have a custom car built from the ground up, you're not going to be able to get a car that suits you in every conceivable way. When you go out and you look for a car, you're going to try and find the car that's least bad, that suits your needs, that has the amenities you want, and sometimes they're not going to be mixed together because those people who produce cars, they're creating cars in a way that suits their production facilities, that which they think will sell to a large number of people, which will appeal to most people. But maybe those mass-produced cars that appeal to most people don't appeal to you. Well, too bad. I mean, you can't have everything you want in life. And the same is true of communities. If we were going to choose among those communities, the more choices you have, the better the odds are that you're going to be able to find one that suits you in terms of your religion, your worldview, your habits, your family type, your sexual orientation, all of these things. There's going to be probably something that suits you relatively well. Now, what this means then is that those communities are probably going to have people in them that want to preserve, to some extent, a certain type of community that they like. And this takes us then to the issue of the covenant community, and this is something that Hoppe discusses. And we'll start with a quote from him. So we can imagine one of these very small states, the Republic of Pasadena, for example, where this is just about 80,000 people or so, and we all live in this community, and people come and go. But if you move there, it's probably a deliberate choice. This is small enough where after a while, people who stayed, people who came, this was something they did on purpose. They weren't just born there and grew up there. People who live where they live there due to some deliberate act. Just as if you drive a Toyota, it's because of a deliberate choice you made in most cases. You probably didn't just inherit it from your parents. So Hoppe says all land, so in this covenant community, in this very small state, in this neighborhood, in this place where we entered it and we maybe signed a contract that said we're going to live here because we like it, because it suits our needs. Quote, all land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, and harbors. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted. That is, the owner is permitted to do whatever he pleases with his property as long as he does not physically damage the property of others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less restricted, as is currently the case in some housing developments. The owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property, which might include residential rather than commercial use, no buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to unmarried couples, smokers, or Germans, for instance, unquote. So you can see how this, of course, works with homeowners associations. Now, when you start telling people that, oh, yes, well, in a covenant community-based anarchic order, it'll be somewhat like homeowners association. Well, everybody hates homeowners associations, right? Because for whatever reason, they don't want to read the contract and they don't want to be held to these voluntary rules that they've signed on to. And they think later that they should be able to do whatever they want. But if we were to be living in a system where you had communities to choose from and you had to pick one that best suited you, chances are you're probably going to have to assent to certain rules that are in there. Now, you may not like those rules, and that's why the key is to have other choices. But we could see what the point Hoppe is making here, right? Say you move into a community and your neighbor, he's running a brothel out of his house, and he's got junk cars piled up in the front yard and so on. You might find that objectionable. I mean, I often, when I give talks every now and then to groups of people who fancy themselves libertarian and so on, I ask them, how many of you would be perfectly fine? You believe in private property, right? How many of you would be perfectly fine with your neighbor just having a crack house next door and just running a dealership out of his driveway, all hours of the night, right? That's his property. Don't mess with it, right? Some people in the audience maybe pretend like they have no problem with that, but I don't believe them. I think all of these property rights loving people, they don't like that concept. They recognize there's some way to deal with that. A lot of people deal with that with homeowners associations in many cases. But you could have a more broadly envisioned community as well. Something that we would call a city or a municipality or a city-state that would have its own internal rules. The key to the freedom in that case is that you would have other choices, you would have ease of escape, and of course some way of affecting the rules once you're there. I mean, it's not like these are just static jurisdictions where the rules never change. But it would be certainly not a state in the way we think of it today, with huge frontiers and 100 million people, and escaping is very difficult. And so this is what we're thinking of when we imagine radical decentralization. Small number or a large number of small states where you can influence what happens, but which it's based more on private contract and a deliberate choice you make to live there. Now, there are some other issues here that are important as well. Rothbard spoke of radical decentralization as a type of national liberation. And he uses this in the context of the American Revolution, which writing in Conceived in Liberty, talks about the American Revolution as the first successful war of national liberation, where you had these Americans who weren't quite British, who wanted to do their own thing, and they threw off the chains of their rulers through secession. They were decentralizing the world when they fought to get 13 new independent colonies through the Revolutionary War. But then he applies a similar, he was nothing if not consistent on this issue, and he applies similar analysis later. At the end of the Cold War, for example, he was of course totally in favor of massive decentralization on the ruins of the Soviet Union, and he wanted all the old states of Europe that were behind the Iron Curtain to then be removed from the old Soviet bloc and granted independence. And one issue was the Baltic nations. And something that drove him bonkers at the time was the fact that the establishment in the world at the time was greatly opposed to decentralization. The New York Times and all the usual suspects, they didn't want the Baltic states to secede from the Soviet Union. We're talking about Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia up there, northeast of Poland. And these were countries that had suffered horribly under Soviet domination. And they were talking about leaving the Soviet Union. But the Times and the people in the Bush administration and so on, well, you can't have that. That's just anarchy if you just let these people leave. And we'll turn it into a democratic state. And then the Russians, everyone, all the citizens of the former Soviet Union can vote on what should happen and so on. Well, of course, Rothbard pointed out which way that would go, right? You can imagine if the Baltics were still in some sort of Russian Federation today, how would each vote go? Would the 5 million people who live in the Baltics be able to have any influence over the 100 million people who live in the rest of Russia? It would be absurd. And so Rothbard sums it up this way, dripping with disdain for the very idea. He's kind of summing up the New York Times position. Oh, the Baltic nations are a part of the Soviet Union, and therefore their unilateral secession against the will of the majority of the USSR becomes an affront to democracy, to majority rule, and last but far from least to the unitary, centralizing nation state that allegedly embodies the democratic ideal. And so a lot of people, when they oppose decentralization, it's not just on the grounds that they think the state should have more power and they don't want people doing their own thing. They believe this ideology of the fact that we don't need decentralization because we have democracy and people will just vote. But as we discussed already in our South America example, once you start to do that, what do you do with the problem of minorities? They have no way of asserting any sort of independence or self-determination and so on. And that's why Mises wanted these groups, these minority groups, to be able to break off. And the last issue, the last objection, is the issue of foreign policy. And you can see this in any comments on any articles that we might run about radical decentralization and the benefits of small states. And they always say, oh yes, well small states might seem fine until you have a large neighbor who decides to just conquer you. And there's some good research showing that this really is in fact not the case because richer states do far better in terms of military defense than is really thought. And it's better to be rich than large in many cases. Also, just the historical record shows this isn't true, right? Why didn't the United States just conquer Canada long ago? Why have Canada and the US been at peace since 1815? And why doesn't the US just conquer Mexico? There's a cost to conquering other countries, and you can become a pariah state. It upsets the status quo. Better to just dominate it if you can. However, in research done by a political scientist named Michael Beckley, He's done some good work on military efficiency. And he does a fair amount of empirical research looking at have small states, how have they performed against larger states? And he shows lots of examples. One chief example being Israel, for example. This is a small state surrounded by enemies that does really quite well in terms of defending itself. People say, oh, well, Israel depends on the US as its sponsor and its defender. But that doesn't defeat our argument. It simply shows that some small states are extremely effective at using somebody else's resources to provide defense for themselves. I don't see how that's great for Israel. That shows their success as a small state. And you have a similar issue with the UK. In fact, since the UK ceased to be a great power, they've relied significantly on their alliance with the United States to really promote and defend their interests. And so they've been able to really extend their power as a medium-sized state, really, not a small one. But say they were much smaller, they would still be able to rely on the US because of cultural and economic bonds between the countries. So there's another. And why hasn't the US conquered the United Kingdom, right? There's a small state. Why don't we just take it over and make it the 51st state and so on? Well, there's reasons that doesn't happen. So I would, if you want to look into more of this, I would recommend Beckley's work, where he has historical examples as well. And he says per capita GDP is actually every bit as important, if not more so, than total GDP. So when you're looking at a state like China, yeah, China has total GDP that's very high, but their per capita GDP is very low. So they're not actually nearly as powerful as you suspect they are, because a country that produces a lot because of a large population also consumes a lot. And if you start then siphoning off resources to wars of conquest and so on, that brings further down the per capita consumption, and now you've got civil unrest and a starving population on your hands, and that threatens the actual existence of the state. So there's not some pat answer about, oh yeah, small states are worthless because big states will just conquer them all. Obviously not the case, since there's lots of small states in the world, but also we can see that some good empirical research has been shown that this just simply isn't the case, and there's good reasons for that. So that concludes my talk for today. I would certainly encourage you to look deeply into both the analysis of current small states and how they perform. They're richer. The historical conditions that led to Europe and its prosperity, which was rooted in the small states, and maybe examining further Mises's explanation and strategy for bringing about a world of more small states and how it's significantly more just than the current situation we have. So thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed the deadline. All right, the title of my talk is The Case for Free Trade. I'm going to address some of the arguments for free trade and some of the arguments for protectionism, tariffs, and I only have 45 minutes, so I kind of have to not tackle all of the thorny issues here, but I'll try to provide you with a foundation for thinking about these arguments. I'll try to provide you with a framework for thinking about the arguments for free trade and protectionism. It's my position that the Austrians need to spend more time on these issues. There's not a whole lot about this in Human Action or Man, Economy, and State. There are books that are Austrian-ish on this issue, and I'll mention a couple of them while I'm talking today. We start with the fact that by now you have a firm grasp on the argument that in an unhampered market economy, resources tend to be allocated towards consumers' most urgent wants because entrepreneurs have a profit incentive to do just that. The unhampered market economy is economically preferable to interventionism. That argument does not directly counter the arguments for tariffs. And the reason is tariffs hamper the world economy. They don't necessarily, the arguments for an unhampered economy do not apply to tariffs because tariffs hamper the world economy. So we're talking about the domestic economy. Both sides of the debate are concerned with the domestic economy, not the world economy. And Mises makes this point. In Human Action, Mises says that liberals believe that peaceful international cooperation is a more appropriate means than conflict for attainment of the end which they and the nationalists are both aiming at, their own nation's welfare. They do not, as the nationalists charge, advocate peace and free trade in order to betray their own nation's interests to those of foreigners. On the contrary, they consider peace and free trade the best means to make their own nation wealthy. What separates the free traders from the nationalists is not ends, but the means recommended for attainment of the ends common to both. So both sides of the debate are generally talking about the domestic economy. All right, the next point is, consider the following question. Could the government intervene in the economy in a manner that enriched Alabama at the expense of other parts of the economy? And undoubtedly they could. We agree on this, we write about these things. And could they use the tariff to harm, to exploit regions of the economy and benefit other regions of the economy? Yes, they could, and they did exactly that throughout the 1800s. They used the tariff, the North used the tariff to enrich the northern business interests and exploit the South. I'll just cite Tom DiLorenzo's Real Lincoln on this, where a northern newspaper editor admits exactly that. The Daily Chicago Times candidly admitted that the tariff was indeed a tool used by northerners for the purpose of plundering the South. The editor of the newspaper warned that the benefits of this political plunder would be threatened by the existence of free trade in the South. You can use the tariff to transfer wealth from the South to the North. So we have to ask ourselves, why can't they use the tariff to transfer wealth from Asia to the US? That's the argument for tariffs, right? The argument for tariffs is not that it doesn't hurt the world economy, it's that the benefits of the tariff outweigh any damage to our domestic economy. So we're almost giving in to them because we admit they can use the tariff to transfer wealth from one region to another. All right. I already sense skepticism here. All right, well, we start off always with the argument that there's gains from trade. Dr. Rittenauer has covered this completely, so I don't have to say very much about this, but I'll make a few comments. When Dr. Rittenauer talked about the division of labor earlier this week, he did a great job. Of course, there are benefits from trade. Mises recognizes this in many places. I'll cite one such article, Autarky, The Road to Misery. Mises argues that The division of labor is the foundation of European culture here. It's an older article. But this doesn't have anything to do with tariffs. Mises is just arguing that trade is better than not trading. Right? And the basis of this argument is usually we start with Adam Smith here, where Smith argued, among many other things, regarding trade. He argued that the division of labor leads to specialization, and in that specialization, we're more productive. If I spend lots of time doing something, I just become better at it. The examples abound. If I work on my own cars, but I'm not a very good mechanic, but if I spent 40 hours a week being a mechanic, I would become very good at it. Right? Smith says the division of labor, however, so far as it can be introduced, occasions in every art, a proportionate increase of the productive powers of labor. Making this point. And then he goes on to start to build the case for free trade by spending several pages on the extent of the market. And if there's a greater extent to the market, then there's greater gains from trade. So if we trade within the United States, the division of labor occurs and there's gains from trade. If we also trade with Europeans and Asians, there's a greater extent of the market and there's greater gains from trade. Most people, or many people, I don't know if most, many people when they make the case for free trade though, base their argument on Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage in his 1817 book. There's some debate if this is actually Ricardo's work, but for today's purposes, we don't need to concern ourselves with that. And Ricardo points out or makes the case that if nations concentrate on producing the goods in which they're a low opportunity cost producer, and they import the goods in which they're a high opportunity cost producer, that they'll benefit. And both parties that do this, both parties to the trade will benefit from this type of trade. This is a foundational argument in economics. Paul Samuelson, when he was asked to cite something in the social sciences, cite a conclusion that was true and non-trivial, said the law of comparative advantage. Another Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman. I apologize to Tom Woods for approvingly citing Paul Krugman. Says, if there were an economist's creed, it would surely contain the affirmation, I understand the principle of comparative advantage. Krugman also says part of our creed is I advocate for free trade. All right, I know that Dr. Rittenauer covered all of this with Harpo and Chico trading beef and mangoes, but let's look briefly at Ricardo's numbers. They're often called Ricardo's magic numbers. If you Google this, all sorts of articles will pop up. But Ricardo's numbers are that he's talking about England and Portugal. England can produce a given amount of cloth using the labor of 100 men and can produce a certain amount of wine with the labor of 120 men. Portugal requires the labor of 90 men to produce that same amount of cloth and only 80 men to produce wine. Portugal uses, it's just a single input model. There's only labor. He's only concerned with the labor theory of value here. Portugal, in a sense, in the absolute sense, is better at producing either product. It requires less labor to produce wine and less labor to produce cloth. But if we think in terms of comparative advantage, Portugal has a comparative advantage in the production of wine and would benefit by specializing in the production of wine and importing cloth from England. Both countries would benefit. Gottfried Haberler, who is Austrian-ish, I guess, at some point. Anyway, he has a great book. It's must reading for Austrians, I think, interested in this topic. His 1936 book, The Theory of International Trade. Rothbard's copy of this book is, most of the book is underlined. Page after page, or just every line being underlined. But Haberler developed our modern formulation of this law in terms of real opportunity costs, real costs and opportunity costs, instead of the labor theory of value. So every once in a while in international law, economics, you'll see the word Austrian, and they'll be referring to Haberler's formulation of the law of comparative advantage. Haberler is, I'm going to get way off track, I think. Haberler is somewhat Austrian. In the book, Austrian Theory of the Trade Cycle and Other Essays, he writes one of the essays. But then by 1974, in his 1974 book, he sounds Keynesian. Right? So, and there's a bit of Keynesianism in his 1936 International Trade book. All right, this is the way we usually explain it at the principles level, something like this. Let's see here. You can't see that. Let's try this one. That's a little better. So here we have England's production possibilities curve for wine and cloth. If England produces wine and cloth efficiently, they'll end up with some combination of wine and cloth, say at point A. If they specialize in the production of cloth and export some cloth and import some wine, they'll end up on this consumption possibilities curve, this red line. They'll end up with more wine and cloth than they could have had if they don't trade with Portugal. England doesn't have to have more capital. They don't need to be smarter. They don't need to work harder. Just by simply trading with Portugal, they end up with a higher standard of living. All right. But these arguments do not tell us that, these arguments by themselves do not tell us that free trade is good. So far, we've just said trading is better than not trading. Free trade is better than autarky. That's all we've said so far. And people like Haberler, and the other book that is must-reading for Austrians is by Leland Yeager and David Turk in 1976. They have a great book on this, and both of them, they don't stop with Ricardo and Smith. That does not end the debate over free trade. You have to, I'll show you today, it's more complicated than that. But we can use this argument to make a case for free trade. We can use Ricardo's argument to make a case for free trade if we make certain assumptions. So suppose we assume the terms of trade are favorable for both countries. The red line that I'll show you is favorable for both countries. Ricardo just asserts that it will be. He doesn't explain with any economics why that would occur. He just makes that assertion. And as far as I know, no one's explained it in terms of Austrian price theory. It's an open avenue for investigation here. But for today's purposes, let's assume the terms of trade are favorable for both countries. Let's assume the tariff does not affect the terms of trade, a false assumption in some cases. Let's assume that trade is balanced. So within Ricardo's formulation, if you have a massive trade surplus, you may be worse off trading than not trading. So Ricardo gets around this by talking about gold flows. He said trade will be balanced because if you have a massive trade surplus and you're exporting lots of goods and not importing very much, gold will flow into the country, your prices will go up, and eventually trade will more or less balance. So eventually you'll have gains from trade because of gold flows. But that argument doesn't apply today. There's no gold flowing in and out of the country. Right? So we also assume that capital and labor are perfectly mobile within a country. There's no pain as in labor markets as workers move from one industry to another. Austrians are sort of middle of the roaders on this issue. So we don't think labor markets are perfect, but we're not Keynesian on this issue. We don't think they're terribly, there's a terrible lot of friction. And importantly, we have to assume that capital and labor do not cross international borders. Another false assumption here. Of course, those things happen today. All right, this is sort of how we explain it using the principle of comparative advantage. So here we have the red line shows the consumption possibilities curve. If there's free trade, England ends up at point C here with this combination of wine and cloth. If they protect their wine industry, they produce at point B prime. They produce less cloth and more wine. They trade up along this blue consumption possibilities curve. The lines are parallel, indicating the terms of trade are the same, regardless of whether or not there's a tariff. And so they end up on a lower consumption possibilities curve, say at point C prime. So some trade with a tariff is preferable to no trade economically, but free trade is preferable to the tariff. All right, some of the arguments for tariffs are so weak, and these are oftentimes the arguments you hear the most. And we can just stop here and demolish those arguments, more or less. Right? So let's do that. Krugman calls this playing dirty. He says your opponents, the protectionists, often engage in errors of logic and fact. And he says you can demolish them. And he says, Krugman says, this is playing dirty, and I advocate it strongly. All right, so we have this common argument that tariffs lead to more jobs. It increases our employment. If we protect the steel industry, we have more jobs in this country in the steel industry. If we have a tariff on sugar and have high sugar prices, we grow a lot more sugar beets in this country, even though it's a terribly inefficient way to get sugar. And it's true that the tariff does lead to more jobs in the protected industries. But we can easily, I think, counter this argument. If you create jobs in one industry, you lose jobs in another industry. If you protect the English wine industry, jobs are created. But where do those workers and where does that capital come from? It comes from the cloth industry. So you lose jobs in the cloth industry. And Paul Krugman, I'm citing the Krugman stuff before 2000. So in the last 20 years, Krugman is arguing with early Krugman on lots of issues here. But anyway, when discussing this particular argument, Krugman says, constant employment is a reasonable approximation. So he's saying labor markets more or less adjust. Even if it's not painless, the adjustment occurs, and we shouldn't buy into this argument. Hobler, by the way, sort of, in 1936, there's the inklings that he's buying into this. He's talking about the friction in the labor market. And in Murray Rothbard's copy of the book, that's all underlined, and in big letters in the margin, it says, aha, exclamation mark. I don't know, did he catch Hobler? I don't know why it says that. And then by 1950, Hobler writes an article, and builds a formal model showing that in the face of frictions in the labor market, a tariff might be preferable to free trade. At least he can model it. Right? All right. And then there's a series of arguments that basically say either imports are bad or low-priced imports are bad. We can sort of lump all of these arguments together. There's a series of arguments saying that low-priced imports hurt us, either because the low-priced imports are either due to cheap foreign labor, so because wages are low in other countries, they sell us low-priced imports. Our workers have trouble competing with this labor, so goes the argument. And they will have to accept lower wages to be competitive, ignoring the fact that wages are largely determined by the amount of capital per worker, ignoring this Austrian position. And then sometimes the low import prices are just due to firms dumping their products on our markets in order to gain market share. So either way, the argument is low-priced imports hurt our businesses and our workers, and we need to protect ourselves from these low-priced imports, say with a tariff or some other trade restriction. But within the law of comparative advantage, low-priced imports are good. They lead to a better terms of trade. If Portugal would sell England lower priced wine, England wouldn't have to export as much of its cloth. It could import more wine. It would end up with more wine and cloth. So we can use Ricardo's principle here to counter this argument. I'll show you a diagram on this in a moment. But another argument that's really sort of in the same category is the argument that we need to protect ourselves from a trade deficit. That the trade deficit is bad, that the benefits of trade are due to the exports, not the imports. So this is an old mercantilist position that Adam Smith demolished, and we've demolished it several times over by this point. But this is easily countered. Really, the benefits of trade are not due to the exporting, it's due to the importing. By the way, if you want to read about this, you might start with Henry Hazlitt's The Drive for Exports, where he's demolishing this argument in his book, Economics in One Lesson. But just ask yourselves, if we export wheat to Europe and they send us Italian sports cars, do we benefit from watching them eating our wheat, or do we benefit from sporting around in sports cars? And of course, the benefits come as we get to have the sports cars. The benefits come from the imports. It would be even better if we just got to keep our own wheat and eat it. Right? They would just send us free sports cars. And we can show this using this comparative advantage diagram here. So here the red line is the initial terms of trade, this red consumption possibilities curve. Right, so England's specializing at point B, they're specializing in the production of cloth, and they end up at point C. But if there's lower priced imports, England does not have, they can export less cloth, import more wine, and the blue line represents the improved terms of trade. So we're better off with low priced imports than we are with higher priced imports. And if there's a trade deficit, that means you're not exporting as much and you're importing a lot, and still you end up better off than before. And there's the additional benefit of a trade deficit is that if you have a trade deficit, then dollars have flowed out of the country, and those dollars tend to flow back into the country in the terms of some type of foreign investment. Foreigners, the capital flows into the country. So you get the double benefit of having a trade deficit. All right, but there are stronger arguments for tariffs, or at least I'm calling them stronger arguments. There are arguments within the international economic sphere that are considered to be the better arguments for tariffs. Those are not the arguments I've addressed so far, and there's a lot of them. And the reason they are stronger arguments for tariffs is they admit there are gains from trade. They're just arguing that the benefits of the tariff outweigh any losses due to the tariff. So you could buy into Ricardo's argument and still make the case for a tariff. And that's what they do. And you can't end with Ricardo, you can't invoke Ricardo and refute these arguments. So in that sense, they are stronger arguments. All right, one of them is the infant industries argument. This argument goes back, I think it was first made in 1645, and so it goes back, 375 years. It's actually a very complicated issue, and I can't fully address it today, but the argument is, yes, Ricardo's right, free trade is wonderful, we just have to protect industries until they're ready to face international competition. So within this argument, industries are born, somehow, that's not quite explained. And then there's an infancy period where they need protection, and who could be opposed to protecting infants? Aren't we all in favor of this? And then somehow the industry matures, There's very little economics in this explanation, by the way. And then you can have free trade and all the wonders and glories of the benefits of free trade. You just have to protect the industry until it's ready for competitive pressures. All right, there's a lot of issues here. I'll just address a couple of them. One of them is the lack of sophisticated economic analysis in this argument. It's more of a biological explanation, analogy of what's going on. So protected industries never mature, and the reason is there's no explanation for how the industry arises. There's no entrepreneur making an investment decision, expecting the present value of the future stream of profits to be positive or anything. Somehow the industry just arises. So there's no entrepreneur in this. There's no price, or very little price theory or anything in this explanation. So industries never mature, and that's because entrepreneurs make different decisions if they're being protected from international competition than they would if they're facing international pressure. So if you're a protected industry, the entrepreneurs in that industry build businesses that have characteristics A, B, and C, because they're not facing international competition. But if you're facing international competition, you build different businesses with different characteristics. So you're never ready for free trade because you have not built businesses. Investors have not built businesses that are ready to compete. So I can't find any example where an industry said, yes, we're ready. Please, we don't need protection anymore. We're so healthy and strong. Let's have some free trade. Right? It's just, of course they don't. I think the main issue is that there's the lack of any entrepreneur in this theory. So the infant industries people, they don't want to protect all industries. They want to protect industries that are beneficial over the life of the industry. Well, aren't those the industries entrepreneurs will fund? Entrepreneurs are willing to take losses up front. They do it all the time in order to make profits over the life of their investment. Entrepreneurs will fund the correct industries. The industries that we want to be born and we want them to survive are the industries that don't need protection, because entrepreneurs will fund those industries. Murray Rothbard makes this point. Mises also demolishes this argument, this infant industries argument. Rothbard says, in fact, if long-run prospects in the new industry are so promising, why does not private enterprise, ever on the lookout for a profitable investment opportunity, enter the new field? So if it's such a great deal in the long run, of course, the private investment will take care of this. We don't need protection. It's only because entrepreneurs realize that such investment would be uneconomic, i.e. it would waste capital, land, and labor that it could otherwise be invested to satisfy more urgent desires of the consumers. So if you're protecting industries that investors won't fund, then you're wasting land, labor, and capital. All right, another argument, I'll get to a couple more. Another argument, and this argument, let me point out that within this infant industries argument, I'm assuming the capital is coming from domestic sources. So I'm if you fund the wine industry through protection, then it comes from English capital. Portugal is not building wine factories in England, right? It's important to make that distinction. All right. Another argument is the terms of trade argument. It's called the optimal tariff argument. This argument began soon after Ricardo's book. By 1824, Robert Torrens is starting to make this argument, although he doesn't really spell it out until the 1840s. And this argument raged throughout the 1800s. So here's the argument. See, with the principle of comparative advantage, we're assuming the tariff will not affect the terms of trade. But if you're a large country, when you buy a lot of international goods, the tariff could affect the terms of trade. So if you put a tariff on a product, the decreased demand internationally for that product falls, the price falls, and you have a better terms of trade. So far, the argument is, that could happen. I mean, that's a possibility. And then, so the terms of trade people say, well, if the benefits of the increased terms of the improved terms of trade exceed any damage due to inefficiency losses due to the tariff, then you're better off with the tariff. All right, so here's the way we would explain it using Ricardo's formulation. So the red line indicates the free trade consumption possibilities curve. You know, it indicates the terms of trade between England and Portugal. England protects their wine industry again. They produce at point B prime instead of point B. They produce some wine, they produce less cloth. But the blue line indicates the improved terms of trade. And in this example, the terms of trade have improved so much that England doesn't export very much cloth. They import lots and lots of wine, and they end up at point C prime. A guy named Humphrey has the devastating article, the article that devastates the infant industries argument, excuse me. He makes a lot of points. His main point is that it's just really impossible to spot this type of situation. For a government official, it's just impossible to spot the tariff that would make this happen. And if you did spot it, you would have, the tariff that makes this happen now is different than the tariff rate you need in a month, because everything keeps changing. You know, supply and demand keeps changing, consumers' preferences change. So one of his main points is that it's just impossible for government officials to implement this, such a policy. There's a lot of other arguments here. But. All right. Here's the argument that I think is important, that is addressed in the literature, but I think it's not addressed enough. It's an argument about capital flows and foreign investment. So Habeler in 1936 talks about this a lot. Leland Yeager in 1976 talks about this a lot. It is addressed in the literature, but mainstream neoclassical economists tend to not pay attention to this very much. So here's the argument. The argument is that if we impose a tariff on a product, then foreign investors will fund that industry to some degree. So if we protect our car industry like we did, then all the foreign car companies built factories in the southern states, in South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Texas, right? So they funded the industry. Capital flowed into the country because of the protection. That's the argument, that there are benefits from tariffs due to the foreign investment. And politicians, as they stumble around and talk about these things, sometimes sort of make this argument. So I think President Trump has made this argument, Obama, Bush. I think this is the argument that's being made in the political sphere. Pat Buchanan has been making this argument for a long time. In 2019, he wrote the article, Tariffs, the Taxes That Made America Great, where he made this exact argument that the reason we had so much foreign investment in the 1800s was due to the high tariffs. All right, let's make sure we understand the argument. So the first step of the argument is that if you protect an industry with a tariff, that'll increase foreign investment, capital flows to the protected industry. And that's assuredly happened. Habeler says there's just lots and lots of examples of this. It's just, if you protect an industry, it's possible foreigners to some degree fund that industry. All right, so that step in the argument's irrefutable. Are there benefits from the foreign investment? Mises, time and time again, talks about the benefits of foreign investment in your economy. He just hammers this point to death. I could cite many articles, many places he talks about this. Certainly foreign investment increases your capital stock. You might look at, in 1958, he did a series of lectures in Argentina. One of them is titled Foreign Investment. It's in the book Economic Policy, Thoughts for Today and Tomorrow. So the argument is that if the benefits from the capital accumulation exceed any damage done by the tariff, then you're better off with the tariff than you are without the tariff. The politicians that make this argument are discounting any damage to a tariff. They're only looking at the benefits. But you could make an argument saying if the benefits of the capital accumulation exceed any damage, then there are net benefits to having a tariff. See, the point here, the reason you can't use Ricardo here is Ricardo assumes the opportunity cost is domestic. So if you build up your wine industry, the opportunity cost is you have less cloth. But according to this argument, if you build up your wine industry, Portugal has a smaller wine industry. The opportunity cost is borne by the other country. This is why you can't use Ricardo to refute this. All right. There's a lot, this is a really thorny issue that I'm working on. One argument is that just because there is foreign investment in the protected industry, that does not imply necessarily that you get more capital overall. The economy is very complicated. The various industries are linked, and if you affect one industry, the effects ripple out through the economy. I ask you to remember Dr. Newman's ham sandwich diagram, where a simple ham sandwich, to construct a simple ham sandwich requires this massive structure of production throughout the economy. And if you change one part of it, it could change lots of industries. Habeler spends a lot of time on this in his book. So if one industry expands, other industries throughout the economy will expand and contract. And so for every industry that expands, that's an opportunity for foreign investment. And for every industry that contracts, that means we produce less of that product. That means foreigners produce more of that product. So that's an opportunity for our investors to invest overseas. So just because capital flows into one industry does not mean you get a net capital increase, because capital will flow outside the country in other industries. So Habeler works through this analysis in detail, and then he says it's unlikely you get more capital. He doesn't say it's impossible. He just says it's unlikely. I think a really good argument is that tariffs are not the main determinant of foreign investment. When Mises talks about this, he's not talking about the tariff, he's talking about other institutions that encourage foreign investment time and time again. So foreign investment is largely determined by just the overall health of your economy. And foreign investors want to invest in a healthy economy. It's determined by other governmental policies, tax policies, are property rights being enforced? Is my investment going to be nationalized after a while? It's just, there's a lot of issues here. And tariffs are a small part of the decision regarding international capital flows. So just because you have a tariff, that doesn't mean you're going to suddenly have massive flows of foreign investment. Mises, by the way, in the middle of one of his discussions of capital, just throws out the line that a tariff cannot increase capital stock. But he doesn't, there's no explanation. I would like to accept the statement, but he doesn't explain why it can't. He just asserts it. All right, so these are some of the stronger arguments for tariffs, and there are other strong arguments for tariffs that I don't have time to talk about, but we can sort of build a case against all of the arguments. And all of the arguments for tariffs generally make false assumptions. And we can use this. So they abstract from the real world. So one of the arguments that they almost always make when the economists build a model regarding tariffs and they say, look, a tariff might be beneficial, there's always the statement in there that foreign governments are passive. And that means no retaliation, right? So even if you could imagine a situation where a tariff was welfare enhancing, other governments are likely to retaliate and eliminate any gains here. So the pro-tariff side just assumes this possibility away. But of course, this will happen. Also, they always assume away any public choice issues. They always assume that government officials will try to act in the national interest, and they won't bow to political pressures. They won't cater to special interests like I talked about a couple of days ago. Paul Krugman, when talking about tariffs, makes this point. Krugman used to be sort of a cautious free trader, more or less, even though he wins the Nobel Prize for writing, building models in favor of tariffs. But then at the end he goes, it's pretty hard to do this in the real world. And one of the reasons he says this, he says governments do not necessarily act in the national interest. Do not necessarily act in the national interest. Do they ever act in the national interest? Especially when making detailed microeconomic interventions. Instead, they are influenced by interest group pressure. Well, of course they are. What if there was a world where other governments didn't retaliate and government officials were angelic beings resisting political pressures? Couldn't they then impose a tariff that was welfare enhancing? No. So this is similar, I think, to the calculation argument for the impossibility of socialism. It's just impossible to do this because it's just too complicated. It's impossible to identify the tariff rate that would be welfare enhancing. There's too many moving parts in the economy, and things keep changing. I mean, you would have to just continually adjust the tariff rate. It's an impossible situation. It's like trying to allocate resources in the absence of market prices for the resources. Just like that's impossible. This is also impossible. Or like Dr. Terrell talked about regarding externalities. It's impossible to know the optimal amount of pollution or something. The information is not there. Even the entrepreneurs making the decisions, they don't know what the future holds regarding capital flows and things. All right, it's impossible for government officials to determine a protectionist policy. Free trade is implementable. You can have free trade. You can just say we have free trade. You can't have welfare-enhancing protectionist policies. And Yeager, the other book you should read is by Yeager and Turk, if you're interested in this. They're not talking about capital flows. They're just making the general case for free trade here. And they say the protectionist slogan that free trade may be right in theory, this is a slogan you hear, free trade's right in theory but wrong in practice, becomes more sensible when the word protectionism replaces free trade. Free trade is a meaningful, specific, discussable policy proposal. Ideal protectionism is not. That's my case for free trade. Thank you. Right on time. What do you think, Jonas?
you just pour that water?
Okay, it looks like we're pretty close to the witching hour here. That clock back there says 11 o'clock. I'll get all the slackers out of the hallway there. So this talk, the title of this talk is Myths of Market Failure. And maybe I'll give you a little history of economic thought background on this, since I've published articles and things on this whole thing over the years. And one of my articles I published, co-authored with Jack High, back a long time ago when we were both at George Mason, it was about antitrust and competition. And one of the things points we made in there is that until you get to the 1930s, really, economic writers who wrote on the subject of competition and monopoly law was relatively new. The first federal antitrust law in the U.S. was 1890, and I think it was the first anti-monopoly law in the world, actually. And then other countries followed suit. Most economic writers thought of competition like the Austrians did and do today as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship and discovery. That's basically, and it's an ongoing and dynamic process, never-ending process. They didn't think of competition in those days as perfect competition with all those assumptions of many firms, perfect information, homogeneous products, and all that. That came around the 1930s. And so, as long as economists understood this, that this is the nature of markets, there wasn't a big literature on market failure. But that all changed with the advent of the so-called competitive model, where the economics profession began trying to imitate the physical sciences, physics in particular, and to construct mathematical models of competition. So all of a sudden in the 1930s and thereafter, the markets hadn't changed, but the theory of markets changed. The benchmark of efficiency became the perfect competition model. And so all of a sudden there were all these books and things written about how markets fail. And part of it was motivated by the existence of the Great Depression and the impulse to blame capitalism for the Great Depression, not the Fed, anything but government, and not the massive 15 years of government intervention in the United States that caused this. It was capitalism. Okay, and so there were all of a sudden all these books, and so it became a real industry within the economics profession in the 30s, 40s, 50s, especially in market failure, and one of the and what it created is what the economist Harold Dempsey called the Nirvana fallacy. It led to this fallacy called the Nirvana fallacy. And this language came from an article that Harold Dempsey, he's a UCLA economist, he passed away last year. He was a great economist. He was a fellow traveler of the Austrians. He never called himself an Austrian. But when I was in graduate school 115 years ago, shortly after they slayed the last dinosaur, like out in Montana somewhere. I remember reading about it in the school newspaper. But I was a big fan of Demset's research, mostly because it was very Austrian-like and it's very applied, and it was published in places like the American Economic Review. And so, but anyway, this one article of his, I think it was 1969, Journal of Law and Economics, and it was a debate with Kenneth Arrow, who was a Nobel Prize, one of the early Nobel Prize winning economists, Kenneth Arrow. And they were debating over market failure, and Demsetz used this phrase. I don't know if he was the first one to coin it, but he used the phrase nirvana fallacy to say that, well, this is the method of analysis that Kenneth Arrow is using. And at the time, he was using Arrow as an example, a very prominent example of the type of analysis that went into market failure analysis. Okay. Now, what is a nirvana fallacy? Well, it's basically establishing some sort of benchmark for efficiency, perfect competition. And you think of the old assumptions, the original assumptions of this model of the time, many firms, whatever that is, many, perfect or homogeneous products, everybody produces the same thing. Homogeneous prices, everyone charges the same price. Perfect information, consumers know everything there is to know about the market, and producers know how to minimize costs and maximize profits. And so forth. So that's perfection. And the method of analysis was to assume that that's perfection and then compare that to the real world. And then the real world inevitably fails everywhere. And in this article that I mentioned with Jack High, that was published in Economic Inquiry way back in 1988, when I was just 5 years old. Just kidding, she thinks I'm serious. But we mentioned, I lost my train of thought since I made a joke. So anyway, in this article, the nirvana fallacy, let's see what I wanted to make here. Well, yeah, the debate with Demsetz, he was making the point that this is really a bad method of analysis. It's dishonest. He didn't say dishonest. I think it's dishonest to point this never achievable ideal and compare the real world to it and say the real world fails. And then the point I was going to make is that we cite in this article some literature, some books that were celebratory, and economic journal articles. They said things like, at long last, we have discovered that there's market failures everywhere, and we can now construct a positive government program to save the world from market failure. It was really ridiculous. I thought they were celebrating. You would think if they discovered that there was the wheels were running off of the economy, they wouldn't be so happy about it. But these statist economists at the time were. And so it was a big deal, and that led to the publication of books by Edward Chamberlain and Joan Robinson on monopolistic competition, which is sort of like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence. If you don't like country music, it would be country music, or whatever it is, as far as that goes. And so, and even an old Chicago School law and economics scholar, the late Robert Bork, who was also a federal judge, he wrote a big book on antitrust economics. And one of my favorite lines in the book is when he said, if the government actually tried to force perfect competition on us, it would have the same effect on the economy roughly as several strategically placed nuclear explosions on the economy, if we really took this seriously. But that became the method of analysis. And here's like one simple example of the method of analysis. There was a literature on innovation, product innovation. And this was sort of a takeoff of monopolistic competition. I'm not going to get into monopolistic competition, but in the 70s and 80s, there was a whole literature in the economics journals. It was, I always considered it sort of a footnote to the theory of monopolistic competition that was highly critical of technological innovation, claiming it created monopolies. And the simple, Econ 101 analysis, this is the textbook monopoly diagram, and from the, principles of micro textbook, a monopoly model, monopolists will equate marginal revenue and marginal cost and decide that this is the profit maximizing level of output here and charge the monopoly price. But if this were competition, this would be the marginal cost curve here would be the supply curve, and here would be the supply and demand. That'd be the equilibrium quantity here, QC. And so there was this literature that basically said innovation needs to be regulated by the state because it creates monopoly. It should be, part of anti-monopoly regulation. And most importantly, what does monopoly do? It restricts output and causes a deadweight loss. There's a deadweight loss, and the loss in consumer surplus. Okay, and Demsetz came out and made what seemed to me to be a pretty obvious point, is that, hold on now, what you're saying is that if maybe 100 people had the idea at the same time, okay, for this innovation, then you would have Q sub C, that would be the output. But that didn't happen. Somebody did it first. Therefore, you have QM. And so what you're doing is you're comparing this utopian ideal where 100 people, the same light bulb went off in their heads simultaneously, and therefore they all invented this product and put it all in the market at the exact same moment, perfect competition. And you compare that to the real world where only one guy did it, and the real world fails. And Demsetz says that's an inappropriate comparison. What you should be comparing to, if you're concerned about output, production, is today, okay, let's say the invention comes on the market tomorrow. The appropriate comparison would be today when you have zero output of this product compared to tomorrow when it's invented and you have this much, QM. Okay, there's an expansion of output. There's not a restriction of output. The invention and innovation expands production in the marketplace, doesn't restrict reduction in the marketplace. And of course, it's always going to be that way. If you make this assumption of perfectly competitive equilibrium that everybody had the same invention, and so that's an example of the nirvana fallacy that leads to. Invariably, it always leads to recommendations for more regulation, more control, more government outright production of resources. And this is kind of related to another type, a more modern version of so-called market failure, for which Joseph Stiglitz, among other people, and somebody else won a Nobel Prize in economics. And this is called asymmetric information. So yes, some of you have taken microeconomics may have heard of this, supposedly a form of market failure. The fact that we all have different information. But one of the original articles on this, on asymmetric information, was on what's called the lemons problem. It was an article that claimed that used car dealers have more information about the cars than the buyers do. Therefore, they're likely to sell you a lemon. Lemon as being a word for a car that has some sort of problem, and the engine's about to blow or something like that. And then the prediction that came out of this article was that the used car market, people would catch on that they're selling you lemons, and so the used car market would disappear. The author of this was Bruce Akerlof, who's the husband of Janet Yellen, the former Fed chairman. And so that was the lemons problem, was published in the American Economic Review. But what he didn't mention at the time, this was published in the early 70s, and at the time, the warranty market had solved the lemons problem. The used car dealers had warranties that said, that exists today. If you go to CarMax, which is, a big used car sales place in the United States, and you buy a car, and the last time I did, I bought and sold several cars, it was CarMax, and they used to give you 7 days to bring the car back, no questions asked if you don't like it, and they give you all your money back. And so that solves the lemon problem. You're not going to buy a lemon. You have plenty of time to take it to a mechanic and make sure you weren't sold a defective car. And that existed when Akerlof wrote the article. Okay, and so I published a little article about this years later, and I want a short quote from von Mises on this point of saying that this is a market failure. And keep in mind, the market failure has to do with this point that everybody has the same information. That is said to be a desirable thing. You know, talk about nirvana. And if I can find, here's what Mises said. Mises said this: the adjustment of prices to every change in the data would be achieved at one stroke. So that's what he's talking about, that the market, everybody knows at the same time. At one stroke, there's a change in the marketplace, and that everybody knows about it at the same time. It is impossible to imagine such uniformity in the correct cognition and appraisal of changes in data except by the intercession of superhuman agencies. We would have to assume that every man is approached by an angel informing him of the change in the data. Okay, an angel. Moreover, even if market participants did possess the same data and information, they are bound to appraise it differently. So even if the angel did come and give us all the same information about this new product, let's say, we would all appraise that information differently because we're all different. And so, in other words, it's a human impossibility to think that people would all have the same information. And of course, asymmetric information is why markets work. It's another word for it would be the division of labor. You know, who knows more about how to manufacture an automobile, you or the automobile manufacturers? Who knows more about how to build a house, home builders or you? Everything in your life, when you think about it, the reason we have human civilization is the international division of labor, but somehow people like Joseph Stiglitz have sort of confused this and called it asymmetric information leading to market failure. But it's really, in the old days, maybe 50 years ago, when we were in a machine age, the language we did use was division of labor, but there's also division of information. Now that we have a more information age economy, we can talk about this more in terms of the division of information, not just a division of knowledge, or division of labor rather. And I also quote Hayek in the same article because Hayek, way back in the 40s, also was writing about this, about the undesirability or the unreality of all this. So that's one type of market failure problem, the nirvana fallacy. And it's pretty pervasive in a bunch of the literature. And just think of that perfect competition model and all those unrealistic assumptions. And I assume Peter Klein probably mentioned that. And there's also a good literature now. Another point before I proceed, though, is the way the economics profession handled this. I gave you a little bit of a history lesson earlier, talking about Demsets and all these people, is that when the public choice school came along in the 1960s, basically, the economics of political decision-making. Not everyone here, I assume, knows what public choice economics is. Maybe you've run across it in a textbook. What they did basically was to accept the market failure literature and say, okay, we accept all this market failure literature, but let's apply the same criterion of Pareto optimality to government, because government allocates a lot of resources too. And so they claim to have constructed a theory of government failure to work alongside the theory of market failure. And Harold Demsetz, who I mentioned earlier, he calls this comparative institutional analysis. So a lot of the research that you would find by the Chicago School economists, published in the Journal of Law and Economics, the Journal of Political Economy, goes by this type of methodology of assuming, without even challenging the market failure analysis, take a look at, well, what's the alternative? How is government likely is it likely to do better or worse? And of course, the big theme of the public choice literature is that even if there is, quote, failure of markets, governments will fail orders of magnitude worse, typically. And so if you compare the two institutions, the method of analysis would be to make a decision on which is less perfect, not comparing perfection to reality, but imperfection to imperfection. That's sort of the method of analysis. Now, there's another strain of research that has always challenged the market failure. Of course, the Austrians never accepted the perfect competition model as a model of competition. They've always been around, always had that view. They never changed their view of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship. But there are a lot of other economists, Chicago School and elsewhere, and Austrian economists who have done a lot of applied research looking into all the various theories of market failure. And so I'm going to talk about some of them and maybe pique your interest into looking up some of this literature. And one old article was by Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize winning economist from Chicago. He's not an Austrian, but his famous article about the lighthouse was, it's still being debated actually in economics literature. But I always thought this was a great type of research that I really appreciated, because Coase did what the market failure economists typically did not do. The market failure literature became very highly mathematized, very highly quantitative. Typically an article would be published in some highfalutin economics journal with 116 equations to prove that markets once again fail. And there would be not a bit of reality in it. No case studies, not even no statistics, all theory. And so for many, many years, the lighthouse was used as an example of the free rider problem, market failure due to a free rider problem. The theory being, once a light is shined over a harbor, it creates a public good. And so the next ship to come by has no incentive at all to pay for the public good. Therefore, you will have an inadequate provision of lighthouses in the world. And in textbook after textbook that was used. And so in Coase's article, it's called The Lighthouse in Economics, published a long time ago in the Journal of Law and Economics. I'll take one short quote by Paul Samuelson. In Paul Samuelson's famous textbook, it says, "Take our earlier case of a lighthouse to warn against rocks. Its beam helps everyone in sight. A businessman could not build it for a profit, since he cannot claim a price from each user. This certainly is the kind of activity that governments would naturally undertake." And that was Paul Samuelson's textbook, which was the biggest selling textbook in economics in the world from 1948 until the 1980s. And all during that time, all the top competitors for that textbook were basically clones of Samuelson's textbook. So this is what generations of economics students were taught as a quintessential example of market failure due to the free rider problem. And so, but Coase did the unheard of at Harvard and MIT anyway. He got up off his swivel chair in his faculty office and went to the library. Can you imagine a professor, at a distinguished institution like that, walking across campus to the library and reading a book? Oh my God, what is this world coming to? They're supposed to sit on their behinds until they die, playing with mathematical models if you're an MIT economics professor. Well, anyway, basically what Coase found, he did a case study of the British lighthouse system in history and found that private enterprise had built private lighthouses, in antiquity. And because it was in their own self-interest to do it. They were entrepreneurs. And they knew it would be very dangerous to ship cargo from America all the way across the Atlantic to England, and then have a storm pop up at the last day of the voyage and have their ship crash on the rocks. And if they weren't sufficiently insured, they're up the creek without a paddle, so to speak, maybe literally up the creek without a paddle if that were to happen. And that's in a nutshell, that's what Coase found. So I just wanted to bring some of this literature to your attention. And at the end of his article, he says this, and after quoting the great Paul Samuelson and another Nobel Prize winning economist saying this, Coase says this: "The question remains, how is it that these great men have in their economic writings been led to make statements about lighthouses which are misleading as to the facts, whose meaning, if thought about in a concrete fashion, is quite unclear, and which, to the extent that they imply a policy conclusion, are very likely wrong. Okay, and well, he basically says what I just said. They're lazy. They didn't look around. They didn't do the research. Okay, and that's why I'm mentioning this particular type of research. Now, I'm going to give a couple more examples, and what runs through these examples that I'm going to mention of this is that these stories of market failure tend to ignore three main things that they all seem to ignore. Is one, the dynamic nature of markets. They tend to take a snapshot at a point in time of a market, and they're unhappy with the outcome because it's not perfection. They also tend to ignore, not always, tend to ignore entrepreneurial discovery. Because after all, if there is a problem, like not enough light in the harbor, well, surely it's in somebody's self-interest to solve that problem because there's going to be money in it in solving that problem. Especially if there's money in it, why wouldn't they solve it? They don't need some professor from MIT to tell them how to make a buck. They're gonna work at it, and the human mind, often will succeed in doing that. That's what entrepreneurship does. And also, they tend to ignore history and reality because they're just overly theoretical. Not all of the literature. No, there's case studies and things in the literature. But the literature that Coase was talking about and Samuelson, like I said, they tend to think that theory is enough, but theory is not always enough. At least the Chicago School, in its positivism, at least it proposed testing these theories, and the testing is sometimes very dubious, but at least they made some attempt to enter the world of reality to test the theory and see if it could explain things in the world. But a lot of the market failure literature is just pure theory and doesn't make an attempt to do that. Another example, for years, road building. Walter Block, who's not with us, we call him our roads scholar because he's for the past 50 years, he's been making the case for the privatization of roads everywhere. He has all sorts of wild schemes, underground superhighways and everything. And it seems to be zero opportunity cost economics, though. That's because these highways he talks about, it seems to me, would cost trillions of dollars to build. But anyway, but for a long time, there was a free rider problem story, public goods story about roads. It said that, you need government funding of roads and highways because it's a free rider problem. That, once the road is built and if it's difficult or impractical to have a toll everywhere and charge people, there'll be free riders and you'll never be able to raise enough money. And so I would refer you to, there's one other article I'm going to mention on this that I thought was kind of a neat article because of the method of analysis that was done, which is good sort of Austrian school analysis, even if the authors don't call themselves Austrians, although I know one of them does. Let's see. And it's called or this author does, used to anyway, the voluntary provision of public goods, the turnpike companies of early America. It was an economic inquiry some years ago by Daniel Klein. And Danny Klein was an undergraduate student of mine at George Mason 116 years ago, right before they killed that last dinosaur. And at the time, he called himself an Austrian. I don't know I haven't seen him in years and years. I don't know what's that? You guys know Dan Klein is?
No, I had 2 classes.
No, I haven't seen him forever. Last time I saw him, he was a kid. He was like you, but it's been a very long time. But I really like this article because, he did what Coase did. Well, let's see here. Well, early America, they have a problem with roads. So the business people who have invested everything they've got in a business, they're not interested at all in building a road. There's no money in it. There's no money in somebody building a road connecting 2 towns so that all the merchants in the 2 towns can prosper and so forth. And so I'll read you one quote from this, what he found. This is early America, the early 1800s. Between 1794 and 1840, 238 private New England turnpike companies built and operated about 3,750 miles of road. New York led all other states in turnpike mileage with over 4,000 miles as of the year 1821. Pennsylvania was second, reaching a peak of about 2,400 miles in 1832. New Jersey companies operated 550 miles by 1821. Maryland operated 300 miles, on and on. Turnpikes also represented a great improvement in road quality. So basically what he discovered was that while people were saying, the economic historians, that government was absolutely necessary to build roads, private entrepreneurs had already built thousands of miles of roads in early America, and they were mostly toll roads. And it's very interesting that how the entrepreneurs got this to work. They used social ostracism. If you were in a small town and they bought stock, the people of the town bought stock, even though he says that the rate of return on that turnpike company stock might have been 3 or 4%, and you could have earned 8 or 9% somewhere else. But they did it anyway because they realized it was more than the 3 or 4% that was going to be their profit, because their business would now survive, their business or thrive, because it was connected to a bigger market. You know, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, as Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations. So when you expand the market, you expand the division of labor and you prosper more. And so they recognized that. And so they were able to raise enough money through the stock market to have these profit-making turnpike companies. Another famous article in this literature is The Fable of the Bees by Stephen Chung. How many of you have ever heard of this? A couple of you, yeah, okay, just a couple. Okay, The Fable of the Bees, subtitle is An Economic Investigation, another old Journal of Law and Economics article. Well, this is also the same type of research that I kind of like a lot, because it's a combination of good applied price theory, good applied economics, and people who are willing to work hard in research and use their economic vision to research the reality of these markets, their industry studies or market studies. The problem here was supposedly a situation where you have the proximity of an apple orchard and beehives. Okay, the bees pollinate the apple orchard, and therefore the apple orchard owner makes more money because the apples are more prolific. And so that's a positive externality imposed on the apple orchard owner. At the same time, the apple orchard nourishes the bees, so the beekeeper gets more honey from the bees. So there's sort of a reciprocal positive externality with a proximity of beekeepers and apple orchards. And again, Stephen Chung quoted, he was teaching at the University of Washington at the time. This is long before the Antifa riots in Washington State. Okay, and he quotes all these big shot Nobel Prize winners, Francis Batour. When I was in graduate school, I was tortured by having forced to read this big book on market failure by Francis M. Batour. But here's what he said about this whole situation. It's easy to show that if apple blossoms have a positive effect on honey production, any Pareto efficient solution will associate with apple blossoms a positive Lagrangian shadow price. If you haven't taken mathematical economics, you don't know what that is. But don't worry about it. If then apple producers are unable to protect their equity in apple nectar, and markets do not impute to apple blossoms their correct shadow value, more math econ lingo, profit maximizing decisions will fail correctly to allocate resources at the margin. There will be a failure by enforcement. This is what I would call an ownership externality. So he invented a new type of market failure, ownership externality. And this was typical. So when you get to the chapter of the microeconomics textbook on externalities, it was typical that this would be used as one example of a market failure due to an externality problem. And so once again, Stephen Chung did the unheard of. He got up off his butt, and here he is in Washington State. If you went to the local Kroger department store in Auburn today and bought some apples, you'd probably find some apples over there from Washington State. It's a big apple growing place. So he was sitting there right in the middle of the apple growing mecca of the American West. And so he started investigating the apple industry, and lo and behold, he found out that the entrepreneurs in both the beekeeping industry and the apple industry are not as dumb as these Nobel Prize winners in economics thought they were. Okay. And what he found basically is that for generations, they had very specific contracts already worked out, where when the apple blossoms are about to in bloom, we will pay you to move your beehives next to my apple orchard, and we'll all benefit from it. They had very specific things that said, such as, we'll give you 2 weeks warning before we're going to put any pesticides on the blossoms on the apple trees, so you get the bees out of there and it doesn't harm the bees. And this had existed for decades and decades, he said. And so, like I said, this seems to be this penchant on the part of the market failure theorists to think that entrepreneurs are just either dumb or non-existent, and that, you know, there's big money to be made here, and they're just going to walk away. They're not, they need government to force them to make money, to force them. And we do have government subsidies to beekeepers to this day, and I'm not sure if it came from these theorizing, but we do have these policies in the U.S. Like this. Okay. Another of my favorite articles that is very Austrianish by people who don't necessarily call themselves Austrians, as Stephen Chung did. He was a Chicago school guy, but this is the type of economic history I think that Austrian economists have done and should do. Also, is who recognizes this configuration? What is that? That's the keyboard. Yeah, that's the configuration of the keyboard. This too, there was an economist named Paul David who, he was at the University of Tennessee at the time. I looked him up recently. He had some kind of joint appointment with Stanford and Oxford, which sounds pretty prestigious to me. And anyway, he wrote an article, one of the first, claiming that this was a new type of market failure called path dependence, that somehow the market, the consumers adopted this configuration of keyboard even before computers were invented. This was typewriters. And I learned to type on a typewriter in my day. And so they had just gotten rid of the stone tablets. I remember seeing them all out there in the schoolyard in the playground. They threw them all away finally and bought typewriters. So I remember taking a whole class in 9th grade in typing. It's on an IBM Selectric typewriter. And it's probably the most valuable class I ever took in public school, is learning typing, because I became a world-class speed typer by doing that. We competed. We used to have competitions, even out of school, of who can type the fastest without making mistakes, and for money. We put money down in bet. That's what Italians do, everything like that. Everything's a gamble. So anyway, so Paul David said, well, this is a market failure because there's a superior type of keyboard, and it's obviously superior. We have research that shows it's superior, and it had a different name, and the name doesn't have to do with the keys. It's the man's name, and this man's name was Dvorak. So there existed, you know, in the early days of typewriting, the different types of keyboards. You didn't have all the same like we do now. And I talked about this in a talk in Czech Republic a few years ago. I was invited to talk at the Prague University of Economics. And when I mentioned Dvorak, the students all kind of giggled because it's a Czech name. I don't know why that was funny. I thought it was funny that an American would know a Czech name, I guess. August Dvorak. He was an American, but he was of Czech heritage. But anyway, these two economists that have done a lot of good work, good research. Let's see. I'm gonna get this. Stan Leibowitz and Eric and Steve Margolis and Stan Leibowitz is their names, and they wrote. They have a book on Microsoft. It's called Winners, Losers, and Microsoft, which is a fabulous book, the kind of book that Austrian economists should research and write. Even though once again, I don't think they would call themselves that, but they were students of Harold Dempset's at UCLA. So I think there's sort of this hidden connection. I think Dempsey would have, maybe if you tortured him and with electric shock or something, he would have said, okay, I'm an Austrian. But because a lot of his research was like that. But anyway, they researched this and to see, well, is it true? Is it true that there's, these stupid consumers have adopted this inferior technology? And they looked into it, and one thing that raised a big red flag is they looked into where these studies came from that Paul David cited. And here's what they found. They quote, this is a quote from them. They're saying, let's see, here it is. They said, well, there might be a conflict of interest here. They're talking about some author, it doesn't matter what his name is. This author identifies Dvorak as Lieutenant Commander August Dvorak, the U.S. Navy's top expert in the analysis of time and motion studies during World War II. Then there's a man named Earl Strong, a professor at Pennsylvania State University, and one-time chairman of the Office of Machines section of the American Standards Association, reports that the 1944 Navy experiment and some Treasury Department experiments performed in 1946 were conducted by Dr. Dvorak. So the studies claiming that the Dvorak computer keyboard is superior to the QWERTY keyboard were conducted by Dvorak with his typists. And so that doesn't mean it's not true, but that means, well, there's kind of a conflict of interest there. And it so happens that Dvorak owned the patents on the keyboard and had received at least $130,000 from the Carnegie Commission for the studies of the keyboard. So that's kind of like, General Motors comparing General Motors cars with Toyotas and declaring that we've done a scientific study and we've come to the conclusion that General Motors cars are superior to Toyotas. And take that with a little grain of salt, wouldn't you? And so did Leibowitz and Margolis. And so they did other studies, and they had other studies, and they found, they concluded that the QWERTY keyboard might be very, very marginally better in terms of quickness of typing, not huge, but that's what the market shows. And so no, they didn't see a path dependence problem there. And I would argue that the real problem of locked in inferior technology is with government. That's where you lock in technology, because once the government chooses the technology, you automatically have all the special interests that coalesce around it, the manufacturers, the suppliers to the manufacturers, the members of Congress who represent the district where the manufacturer is located, and you provide a political cabal that will defend and protect that technology no matter what. That's why we have so many airplanes in the United States Air Force that the Air Force knows are ineffective, but they keep them anyway. That's why I've been working on a paper on that. I was supposed to give it at the Austrian Economic Research Conference, which was canceled. But I had a whole bunch of literature that I dug up on this, on obsolete government technology. And probably the worst example, or the most spectacular example, is that until just about a year or two ago, the American nuclear arsenal used 7-inch floppy disks. Now I don't know how many of you even know what a floppy disk is, but this is 1970s era computer technology. And in the first computer I ever bought was an IBM PC in the early 80s. And say if I was gonna co-author an article with you and you lived 1,000 miles away, I would put this floppy piece of plastic in the side of the machine, and I could copy my article that I just wrote on it, and then I would send you in the mail the floppy, and then you could do your part. You could add your part to the article that we're co-authoring. And then in the 80s, they adopted hard disks, like 3.5-inch hard disks. But these were 7-inch floppy disks they were using for the nuclear arsenal until just like 2 years ago. They finally, I read an article, they changed that. And so, you know, talk about locked in inferior technology. And you look at the public schools, the stupid school buses, they look the same as they did 60 years ago. And the mailman, the US Postal Service trucks, they haven't changed since I was 2 years old. You know, they look the exact same technology. And so that's where the real problem is. Okay, and so we're about out of time. It looks like I always tell people if I'm the last speaker before lunch that I got a standing ovation because everyone stands up and goes to lunch after the room. And we have 1 minute if there's a question or two about something. I got 1 minute left, I guess.
So with the solution to the public good problem, it's essentially saying that there still are free riders, right? It's just that free riders don't prevent entrepreneurs from constructing.
Well, entrepreneurs sometimes are very good at solving free rider problems. You know, what is private charity about? You know, we have thousands and thousands of private charity that produce things that a lot of economists would consider to be public goods. You know, when just in the 4th of July, I'll give you one example. The 4th of July in my town, it was very strange. You know, usually the city government pays for a 15-minute fireworks display. I live in a beach town right on the Atlantic Ocean, and there's a big 15-minute fireworks display, and then that's it. But this 4th of July, I was walking around town at 9:30 at night, and it seemed like everybody's yard had a private fireworks display. And there are examples in textbooks of a public good being fireworks. You know, once they're provided, how can you exclude anybody from looking at the fireworks? Public good, free rider, therefore we have under provision of fireworks. There was no under provision in Delray Beach, Florida, of fireworks. And I even put on the Lou Rockwell blog, a news helicopter in Los Angeles was flying over LA, and there were just millions of fireworks going off, even though the city of Los Angeles didn't do it. They canceled because of the plague, you know, and so it was canceled. So yeah, entrepreneurs, maybe they won't solve every single free rider problem in the history of the world, but my point is it's been greatly exaggerated as a problem by ignoring those three things: dynamic nature of markets, entrepreneurship, and reality and history. You know, not looking at, you know, has someone solved this problem before? And if you rely too much on theory, that's the sort of the hole that you dig yourself into. And I guess we're out of time, so thank you very much.